Our reading this morning comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 45. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve you, a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father, and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty.' And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him." Well, good morning on this snowy, frosty, slushy morning. And I kind of wondered when I got up this morning how many people would be in church. Maybe I'd be talking to myself. So thank you for coming, and I wish you all safe travels home. And wanted to say thank you so much for having me. I know Maddie introduced me earlier, but my name is Alison, Killeen, and we're neighbors. My home congregation is just across the way at First Congregational Church of Minnesota, and our congregations often share services over the summers, and so it's a pleasure to be here joining you this morning. And I'd also like to thank you for having me here, because I'm not always polite company. You know how people say at a dinner party that you're not supposed to talk about religion or politics? Well, the moment somebody asks me who I am and what I do, our conversation takes a swift turn from the polite. Because I'm a minister, as you can see, I'm an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, but I also am a community organizer, and I'm also a lobbyist. I work at the Joint Religious Legislative Coalition, or JRLC, and if you're not familiar with JRLC, I know that many here are, but in case you're not, we are an interfaith group, we're an interfaith coalition that works for social justice at the state legislature. So my job demands that I depart from social niceties and daily conversations, and it also requires that from time to time when I come as a guest preacher to congregations, I speak about politics in the pulpit, and that's just part of who I am. And so thank you. I'm thankful that you've introduced me here. I was kind of walking around the sanctuary this morning, noticing all the P words, and I see politics is back there, plenty politics. So I thought, okay, we could talk about politics in this place. And then I also thought, well, the theme for today is Pharaoh, and how can you possibly avoid politics when you're thinking about Pharaoh? After all, politics, you see, let me back up a bit. I'm trying to reclaim the word politics. I think when people talk disparagingly about politics, what they're really thinking about is partisanship. So I am on a personal mission to reclaim politics, and I think JRLC in general, I know our executive director, Brian Rushi, often says this as well. We're on a mission to reclaim politics. After all, it's simply the business by which we order our lives. It's the method within which we go about and talk to one another. And naturally, it's a bit chaotic. Everyone has a stake in how our society is ordered. And as we'll see in our text today, as we look into Joseph and his brothers, even that story is not entirely devoid of political decisions as much as it is a story about reconciliation, and it's a story about coming back together as a family. Politics has a part to play in that as well. So there's a saying at the state capitol, and I imagine at other levels too. I learned it within the first few days of starting my position at JRLC almost 4 years ago. It goes a little something like this. In politics, there are no permanent friends, and there are no permanent enemies. Now, that might seem a little calculating, but let me provide an example to illustrate the idea. Politicking, of course, is about negotiating issues. So two parties or more may disagree about something, one issue, but when it comes to a different issue, things might shift around, and all of a sudden they might find themselves on the same side and agreeing on something. So I think about this a lot in my work with JRLC. I'm going to talk a little bit about what JRLC is and who we are. We're a coalition, as I said, for organizations, the Minnesota Council of Churches. We talked about the refugee services that they do. They're one of our 4 coalition groups. The others are the Minnesota Catholic Conference, the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota, and the Islamic Center of Minnesota. Very divergent voices. And if one of these groups disagrees on an issue, even if the other 3 agree, we simply don't work on it. Now, this was never so starkly illustrated, at least in my time so far at JRLC, as this past fall during the marriage debate about the amendment. And I heard some of the prayers about marriage in Minnesota going forward. And as you can imagine, it was hotly contested in our coalition. No one of our groups agreed with the other. They all had slightly different ways of thinking about the marriage amendment, from strongly opposing it to strongly supporting it. And so, of course, JRLC did not take a position on the issue, but at our board level meetings, where people came together on a monthly basis, in the midst of this conversation, the debate that the state was having, we nevertheless had to come together and say, okay, what is it that we do hold in common? What are we going to do in the midst of this election season? So while the rest of the state discussed the marriage amendment and the other amendment and plenty of other things during the election season, all the decisions that we make as people in a democracy, JRLC decided to hold local candidate forums around the state on the topic of child poverty, and to talk about the legislative proposals which we're continuing to work on in the legislature this session, the legislative proposals to reduce child poverty in the state and to end child poverty in the state. And I think I see some folks nodding. Child poverty I'm going to take a little detour. I'll come back, I promise. Child poverty, when in the youngest stages, can really affect the brain development of children. And I know that one of our prayers was about an individual who researches brain development and poverty and how the two are related. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that we didn't let our differences stop us from coming together on good, productive work that we could do together. So you see, in our coalition, we have no permanent friends. We have no permanent enemies. And so as I read our text today, I couldn't help but be influenced a bit by this no permanent friends, no permanent enemies that cut through the way that I thought about Joseph and his brothers. Now, this is a complicated text, to be sure. Between the lines of the reconciliation and the forgiveness of Joseph and his brothers, we find evidence of strong familial trauma amidst a backdrop of institutionalized slavery, overlaid by a harsh region-wide famine. During the time that Joseph has been in Egypt, he's moved from slave to prisoner to high official at the right hand of Pharaoh, one who in all likelihood oversaw many slaves. The context of this story underscores how these decisions made by both Joseph and his brothers are truly matters of life and of death, determining their survival. I'm sure most of us here today remember the Joseph story, but just in case, let's refresh it a little bit. Joseph grew up as an Israelite. He had 12 brothers. He was his father's favorite son, so his brothers were very jealous of him. They cooked up a plot to kill Joseph and at the last minute decided instead to sell him into slavery, which is more or less they expected probably to be the same thing, but this way they could profit from it. They told their father that Joseph was killed by a wild animal. So the Genesis follows Joseph's story into Egypt, where he is a slave and then thrown into jail and has a series of misfortunes that eventually turn into fortune, and he finds himself at the right hand of Pharaoh. And he takes on an Egyptian name, he takes on Egyptian customs, and before long, he's a wise leader. They're in famine, and he has stockpiled food. And so it comes to be that people from all across the region and the famine come to Egypt to find a way to survive. And this is how he comes back into contact with his brothers. You see, Joseph's family, like the rest of the region, are in hard times, and they've come to ask Egypt for help. And this brings them directly into relationship with Joseph, who they don't recognize, since he's an Egyptian custom and with an Egyptian name. But he recognizes them. And so through even more plot twists and turns, Joseph wants to know his brothers if they've changed. And he discovers that they have. And so in this text, we find that he reveals himself to them. It's moving and it's emotional, and there are the text that I read doesn't fully include all of it, but Joseph and his brothers weep upon each other's necks. It's very, very moving. It not all included in the specific reading. But still, no permanent friends and no permanent enemies, as the story goes. The story is very touching, but yet we can't set aside the context in which Joseph and his brothers are. They must have been making all kinds of calculations. Until Joseph has revealed himself, his brothers simply see themselves as working with an Egyptian official. So even once they realize that their brother is in fact their brother, this Egyptian official is their brother, that question of survival and of famine is still at the forefront of their minds. And they still have an elderly father to come back to, whose life hangs in the balance. And on the other hand, Joseph himself, before he reveals himself to his brothers, is trying to test the waters to determine where they are. And he also has other elements to weigh. Remember, these are the same men that sold him into slavery. How can he be sure that he can trust them? He doesn't know at this point if his father is still alive, and if he is, if Joseph's actions to send home food with his brothers would actually save them. And then Joseph also probably feels a sense of loneliness and loss and a desire to reconcile with his family. And overlaying all of this, we have the great P word, Pharaoh. To some extent, it's not even in Joseph's hands to decide whether or not to allow his brothers the food they need to survive, because ultimately it's up to Pharaoh, and Joseph has that to calculate as well in his actions. And so you see, even our personal lives are not devoid of politics. Even our most intimate decisions as human beings can have repercussions that we cannot predict. The brothers' decision to sell Joseph into slavery eventually resulted in Joseph's ascendance to power in Egypt. And the choices we each make in our personal lives likewise have consequences in the world around us. Like it or not, we are intimately interconnected. Dare I say it, we are political beings, if only by virtue of the simple fact that our well-being is bound up in the well-being of our neighbors. So today's text is an example of the intricate chaos of human life, that reconciliation of a family torn apart by slavery, violence, and jealousy is yet possible. In a world of practical calculations, perhaps even because of practical calculations, we are able to build relationships anew, to forge trust as iron takes to fire, to bring love to rise again like the morning sun. But reconciliation takes work. It requires the understanding that in this life we do have no permanent enemies. It's deeply personal, but it is also diplomatic, it's communal, and it's political. Consider the truth commissions in South Africa in the wake of apartheid. In the rebuilding of the nation, the government held truth-telling commissions whose sole purpose was to restore dignity to the victims by acknowledging that what had happened to them was real and it violated their human rights. Instead of being punitive, the justice sought through the truth commissions was intended to be restorative, bringing healing to the whole community so that the country could move on. South Africa's truth commissions are widely regarded to have been successful, but they were not perfect. So much emphasis was placed upon forgiveness that some of the victims who testified ended up feeling pushed to forgive before they were ready, or they felt that their stories of the violation of their human rights were not heard. Furthermore, the wrongs that were examined in the Truth Commission tended to be big and dramatic violations of human rights, but they didn't focus so much on the daily drip of the indignities that were the unavoidable hallmark of apartheid. In a recent study, it was found that over 70% of Afrikaners, that is the white South Africans, largely felt that while apartheid was an unfortunate mistake, they personally held no responsibility. So perhaps it's asking too much of these truth-telling commissions to drastically change the lives of, or the mindsets of all the Afrikaners. And it is true that the truth-telling commissions did shift the mindset of many Afrikaners and of the future of South Africa as a whole. But the point I'm making is that reconciliation work is difficult, and we have to take into account many different pieces. That while it has everything to do with deep-seated emotions around trauma and survival, we cannot go about the work of reconciliation without taking into account the practical aspects of the work. You see, the work of reconciliation brings to light the paradox that in order to forgive, we can never forget. I cannot imagine that Joseph and his brothers never had problems again. Their history alone would have made their lives ripe for discord. Even after they're reconciled, they would have been grounded in the negotiation of what comes next. After the famine is over and the brothers' survival no longer is dependent on Joseph, what do they still have incentive to remain in relationship with him? Or what happens after their father dies? They must have had to renegotiate over and over again the territories of their reconciliation. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was the chair of the South African Truth-Telling Commissions, he once said that in South Africa it was impossible to be optimistic, and that therefore it was necessary to hope. The practical, political work of forgiveness and reconciliation is acting out our hope. When we step into reconciliation with one another, it is with the understanding that we have no permanent friends and no permanent enemies. Instead, we carry the understanding that my well-being is bound up in your well-being, and that it is the stuff of everyday life to be reconciled to one another. And so as we step into our day-to-day lives, let us remember that it can be in conversation with one another that we may find respite, that it might even be in compromise that we become beholden to one another, and that even in politics, we can carry out the promise of hope in your life and in mine. Amen.